good morning, and good evening to those joining us from Asia. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Michelle Struck. I am the Khosravi Chair in Principled Internationalism, the Director of the Humanitarian Agenda, and the Director of the Human Rights Initiative here in Washington, D.C. Today, we are absolutely privileged to bring to you a conversation on the future of democracy and human rights in American foreign policy. This issue is certainly on people's minds and on the global stage as the world has watched the results of a change of hands of US administrations that is about to happen, the results of about 64 countries going to the ballot box this year to have elections in what's been called the year of elections, and some really stunning incidents on the global stage as some democracies, including South Korea, have had surprising events happen and caused us all to think more carefully about what the role of democracy is in terms of the strategies and the politics of countries that we are involved in around the world. One feature of democratic transitions, at least in the United States, is changes that happen in foreign policy. And today, we wanted to bring you a conversation with a distinguished panel of some of the most experienced people in promoting democracy here in Washington, D.C., to talk about the consistency that some, including our distinguished guests here today, are calling for in terms of human rights, American foreign policy, and democracy in American foreign policy. So taking advantage of a new report that one of our panelists today has written called Democracy, Human Rights, and Grand Strategy Towards a Bipartisan Consensus, we will first feature a discussion of this report and then a panel discussion to be able to talk about this issue around the world. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists and then we'll get into the discussion first about the report and then with our panelists today. So our guests I have with us are Ambassador Derek J. Mitchell, joining us from Taipei, Taiwan this evening, which it is quite late there. So we are extremely grateful to him for taking the time to join us on a public panel at midnight. So thank you. He is a senior advisor at the Office of the President of the Center here at the Center for the Strategic and International Studies. He's one of the nation's foremost experts on global democracy and Asian and Pacific political and security affairs. In addition to his role at CSIS, Ambassador Mitchell served as a senior fellow with the International Security Program and director for Asia projects here at CSIS. He also founded CSIS's renowned Southeast Asia program. And outside of CSIS, he served as president of the National Democratic Institute and was the first U.S. ambassador to Burma in 22 years of U.S. history during a historic period in the country's nascent democratic transition. He also had some distinguished positions at the Department of Defense, overseeing Asia policy and Asian Pacific security affairs. Also with us here, we have Nicole Bibin-Sadaka, who is the interim president for Freedom House. So any person interested in democracy certainly knows these robust institutions well, including Freedom House. She serves as the interim president, and she previously served as executive vice president. Prior to joining Freedom House, she held numerous positions at Georgetown University, including serving as the deputy director of the Master of Science program in Foreign Service. And she is the Kelly and David File Fellow at the George W. Bush Institute. She comes to us with a background having served in the Department of State for 10 years, working on democracy promotion, human rights, human trafficking, religious freedom, refugees, counterterrorism, and a number of important issues in action. She also opened and directed the IRI's local governance program in Ecuador. So quite a distinguished background. And last but not least, joining us in the next few minutes is Dr. Daniel Twynham, who is the president of the International Republican Institute, which we'll call IRI. Prior to joining IRI, he served as counselor to the president and director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund. He also served as a member of Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice's policy planning staff, handling Asia during the George W. Bush administration, as the foreign policy advisor to U.S. Senator John McCain, and as a staff member of the U.S. Trade Representative, amongst other distinguished roles. So without further ado, we will move to the part of our program where we're going to have a conversation specifically about the report that I mentioned, which I hope that our audience here joining us online will hopefully right now go click on and read. It's really an extremely, from our perspective here at CSIS, a strategic look at Democracy, Human Rights, and American Grand Strategy, and is co-authored by Michael J. Green, who unfortunately could not be here with us today, also due to some time zone and travel issues. He did want to be here, but Derek will do a phenomenal job of walking us through some of the key findings of that report. So I'll go over to you, Derek, to start. Thank you so much for being here. Could you tell us a little bit about the report, what you argue in it, some of the key arguments that you want the audience to hear, and really how did it come about?
Well, first of all, thanks, Michelle. Thanks for the opportunity. And yeah, it's late here in Taiwan. I think it's probably a appropriate place to do this kind of thing, to talk about the defense of free societies from attack. To do this sitting in Taipei sort of makes sense. Say hello to Nicole here on the screen as well. It's great to be once again side by side with you after many years when I was at NDI, working side by side with you, and look forward to Dan Twining. I am sorry that Mike couldn't join, but I do appreciate his partnership on this important topic. Mike was the driver. Let me just give some context. Mike was the driver of this report as the Scowcroft strategy chair at CSIS. He writes a monograph every year on strategy. And this year, he decided to take a look at this issue of democracy and human rights, something that I know the CSIS board was very interested to examine more closely. Mike and I go back a while. We worked back in the Pentagon in the 90s when I first met him. And I think he knew that I had written a brief paper from my time at NDI on this issue of the strategic rationale for democracy support, which has been kind of an obsession of mine, even back in the 90s, because I came out of NDI, I went to the Pentagon, and then worked in the Pentagon, came back to NDI in 2018. And I always felt this artificial divide between the traditional security hands and the sort of NGO and DRL world, the strategists and the activists. And I always felt there was an actual connection there, but the different traditions and the cultures, as we know, there are cultures in Washington and different traditions, those cultures seem to prevent a recognition of that connection between security, strategy, and values. So anyway, Mike wanted to do this more extended survey on the history of US values-based foreign policy and to offer a strategic agenda for the future. And he reached out to me to do this monograph together. Now, I think one of the motivations of his reaching out to me, particularly because I know he's written with Dan Twining on this in the past as well, is that we are veterans of different political parties. Though I'm not sure what his is these days, but he's a veteran of a different presidential administration, of the George W. Bush. I think Nicole worked in that same administration, I in Obama and Clinton before that, which reflects a core theme of this report, which is that consideration of democracy and human rights has a bipartisan tradition in the United States. And I think it's important to remember that. Now, again, of course, these days, it has to be said up front that what was bipartisan, say, a decade ago, is not necessarily the same today in the era of Trump. And we're obviously in a whole new and uncertain moment politically and in terms of US foreign policy, which used to operate on a general consensus between the parties on foreign policy. But there has been generally a consensus on these issues. And I think Mike and I want to support this kind of recitation of that history of bipartisan consensus. Now, Mike and I come out of this from a strategic policy perspective, and not simply, and we did the report from a strategic policy perspective and not simply as a matter of American morality or ideals. And that extends from our respective backgrounds in the security strategy sphere. It's not that morality doesn't matter to Americans or matters in American foreign policy. There's no doubt that it's been at the core of our self-conception as a nation since our founding. But that it's who we are as Americans line of argument, which is often used, to me has always felt inadequate for making the case as to why this democracy thing matters. So the report opens by tracing the sort of trajectory of our foreign policy since our founding, since our earliest days as a nation, the inconsistency, the pendulum switches back and forth in our policy and the debates about the role of values in US foreign policy, and the fact that it has often been driven by specific major events that have driven this. For instance, promoting democracy and human rights took a severe reputational hit, as we all know, in the aftermath of the Iraq War most recently, but before then, World War I and the Vietnam War, when American leaders put a moralistic spin on each of these conflicts, despite their being really at the core about realpolitik concerns. But that spin and that narrative, I think, affected the way they came out, the way these conflicts came out, made democracy support and the idea of sort of making the world safe for democracy, it suffered in its aftermath. And so that was one reason for swinging back and forth. But the report notes that the pendulum would swing back with the rise of new authoritarian challenges. So with the rise of fascism in the 30s and 40s, it led to Roosevelt's new Four Freedoms and the Atlantic Charter. The post-war rise of the communist challenge induced the Truman Doctrine, and then, much later, Reagan's Westminster speech in 1982. And then most recently, as people are certainly aware of, with the emergence of China and a new axis of autocracy, or as Anne Applebaum calls it in her new book, Autocracy, Inc. It's led to President Biden's framing of the struggle between democracy versus autocracy as a defining challenge of the 21st century. Now, my view of that, we don't want to get into great detail here, but I think it suffered under President Biden because it was never quite defined precisely of what this struggle was between democracy and autocracy as a defining challenge. And it became, I mentioned in a moment, that it became sort of this either great power competition, US versus China, or about countries and about choosing countries, when it really was about norms. What are the defining norms of this century, rather than specifically what country you're going to side with. But anyway, in the report, Mike and I call for an end to this sort of event-driven and undisciplined approach, pendulum swings, and call for a more sustained, informed, and more thoughtful approach to how to promote democracy and human rights that recognizes the fundamental fact, and this is important, that promoting this, that a more democratic world where human rights are protected, has inherent benefit to our national security interests. Again, that bridge between our values, those ideals, and our security. Traditionally, we put those in opposition, the idea of idealism versus realism. And I think that's an anachronism. I'm not sure it ever was appropriate. But this idea of realism versus idealism, I think, has suffused the theoretical community, the strategic community, and we have to get out of these old mindsets. All sides need to get out of their old mindsets and recognize there are inherent benefits. Now, what are those strategic benefits, and what are those national security interests that we have? And we note in the report, first, that there is growing scholarly literature and empirical evidence showing that societies that embed transparency and accountability mechanisms, i.e. democracy, lead notably to better health, security, development, and peace outcomes. And actually such studies about those practical effects of accountable governance are what got the Nobel Prize this year. Darren Acemoglu, I think it's Acemoglu of MIT, won a Nobel Prize this year for those studies about the connection between accountable governance and successful societies. So we comment in the report that on this point, that if a national security strategist were told that there was one factor that would best deliver better health, security, development, and peace outcomes, and potentially make you the ally of billions of people around the world who are seeking a voice and dignity, a voice in their own affairs, you would think that factor would be viewed not as a nice to have or just merely idealistic or intention with considerations of hard strategic interest, but would be a strategic priority. And yet somehow, I think because of the mental baggage, the baggage that people have based on condition, Iraq or other things in their heads, or maybe the way that this has been explained as sort of an all or nothing or an absolute. I think this is, I think it's poisoned the community to not consider the real strategic benefits of democracy and human rights if done right. Now, obviously, there are trade-offs as we consider how to make specific diplomatic policy choices. We don't make the argument that democracy and human rights must uniquely define our foreign policy, or that we should take a one-size-fits-all approach to our global engagement. But the underlying message of the report is that the value of promoting democracy and human rights should be recognized explicitly as a strategic asset, and thus be integrated into the strategic policy mix as other things are, and trade-offs are made as usual in diplomacy. And there's a final point, is that as we make this case that this should be a perennial consideration for us, we note that this is particularly salient these days, given, as I mentioned earlier, that our autocratic adversaries are not sitting still as we debate the issue. As we all understand, China, Russia, and others are increasingly active in seeking to promote an alternative global vision that reflects their illiberal preferences, and are unapologetic in promoting that vision, rhetorically, diplomatically, materially, and even, as we know, militarily around the world. And they're even trying, at times anyway, to appropriate the term democracy itself for themselves, to redefine it to the point of unrecognizability, but that fits their illiberal nature. So we snicker at that at our peril, because they are out there shaping. And those of us who have had sort of this Pentagon background looking at security, we always talked about, we are present globally. Our military presence, our alliances are out there to shape the international security environment. And I think we likewise need to recognize the need to do that in the political normative realm, because nature and geopolitics, we might say, abhor a vacuum. If we leave a vacuum, it will be filled by others. And we are seeing that now. So again, I'll just conclude in this, and I've gone on too long, Michelle, but in the end, we assert that a defining challenge of our time is this issue of what are the norms, what are the rules, what are the standards that will prevail in the international system in the 21st century. And it includes how they will be defined, but also who will define them. And at the same time, we have to join that narrative, what the Chinese call the cognitive battle that is underway for the sympathies of populations worldwide. And we have to do that not only affirmatively and confidently, but thoughtfully. And we can get into some of those details, I think, in the conversation here.
Thank you so much. And I don't think you went on too long, and hopefully our viewers don't either, because this is a fascinating report. And thank you for making these points. I know this certainly resonates with me, coming directly to this position from the Pentagon, where democracy and rule of law were in my policy oversight portfolio. And I definitely observed the backlash from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the way the term was essentially poisoned, despite the fact that, as you mentioned, if these values were not so cherished, and the actions around them, the actual institutions of, transparent, accountable institutions with checks and balances, civilian control of the military, anti-corruption, if these weren't so cherished by Americans, this rhetoric would have never been used to justify so many foreign policy decisions, as you rightly noted. So I think one additional question I'd love to ask you about are really, and I think you got into it a little bit, but it's just in terms of your decision to write this paper, why now? Why is this such an important moment for the U.S. as it looks at, I'm certainly have been an observer of the successive national security strategies that have put strategic competition at the heart of the challenges facing the world, and have also called out transnational threats that have elevated the role of allies and partners in the world, and organized around the unique advantages that the U.S. has, democracy being one. So I'm curious to hear sort of why now, in terms of how you decided to come out with this report.
Well, why not now? As I mentioned earlier, that this has been sort of an obsession of mine for a while. I mean, even I wrote the East Asia Strategy Report, the last of its kind, in 1998 in the Pentagon. And I slipped in, it was right after I had joined and left NDI, and I slipped in a couple pages on the connection between democracy and security. So this has been, it was somewhat controversial in the building doing that, but I kept it in and explained why it matters to both sides that this be the case. So it's been something on my mind for a while. I know Madeleine Albright, when she was around, was trying, and John McCain, they made this case for years and years. But again, the aftermath of Iraq, and I have to say, I'll just, put it out there. People may differ on Iraq, but I think Iraq poisoned the well on these issues. It made the idea of democracy support aggressive and arrogant and US centered and about imposing. There are a lot of myths that surrounded the notion of democracy support. That either it's all about elections or it's about about shaping the world to look like America, that kind of thing. And I just think there is so much baggage that when I was at NDI, I felt that we needed to address that, and that we couldn't be complacent simply to do our work, but we need to explain why this stuff matters and why the strategic community needs to wake up to it. And again, with the rise of China and the fact that we have a real strategic competitor out there, I think it makes it even more urgent and timely than ever to be telling folks that while we can't make it about China, we're not going to win this battle if we make it all about the US and China or great power competition. It has to be about the dignity of people around the world. It has to be about their sovereignty, about their ability to have a say in their own affairs. That's frankly our comparative advantage as Americans. We actually care about others. We have, and we don't always, our policy isn't always sensitive, but we actually do at our core care. And our core tenet is that if others do well, we do well. And the fact is, China doesn't care, and they have a zero-sum idea. They talk win-win and act and think zero-sum, and we need to be in that competition. The Chinese are sort of the one hand clapping here, so to wake people up to this. And I still find, even in the Biden administration, others, when you mention the term democracy or human rights, you get that glaze. You get, the wall comes down because of that baggage. And I'll just say, I'll be very honest, on the other side, in the human rights community, there's a certain way of doing things. It's absolute that we need to start thinking fresh and creatively on that side, because doing democracy work is different than doing human rights work. Human rights work traditionally has been about naming and shaming or absolute, black and white, that kind of stuff, which I think turns off people in government who will have to deal diplomatically in grays and in nuances. While democracy tends to realize we are all fallen. We are all struggling. To be a democracy is to be a work in progress. And therefore, it's much more about sharing the good and the bad. It's much more about being supportive. It's much more being of recognizing the challenges and not being judgmental. And I think we need to be defining these things more actively so that, we're not leaving anything on the sideline. We're leaving this on the sideline when our government does not, as you try to do in the Pentagon or others try to do. If we're not thinking thoughtfully or considering thoughtfully how to do this work, we are leaving, I think, U.S. assets unplayed. And I just think now more than ever, we need to make that case. And it's hard because the baggage is strong and deep.
Thank you so much. So I think now, well, Dan will be joining us in a moment. I'd love to move over to Nicole. It would be wonderful to hear any responses you have to Derek's comments, and I'll point out too that I believe our audience is very familiar with the institutions around that promote democracy around the world. But just to say that while we're having this policy conversation, this strategic conversation, this more abstract conversation, your organization, Freedom House, and certainly IRI and NDI that Derek led, are some of the most action-oriented nonprofit organizations that work around the world in dozens of countries on democracy promotion on a spectrum that ranges from some of the most impoverished countries to countries that are leading economically but still are working to promote democracy. So just to say that I want everyone watching to know that your experience and your organization's experience, as well as Dan's, is coming from this place of action. So I'd love to hear just what your reactions are to the themes that he's mentioned and any thoughts that you want to bring up initially.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michelle, for convening. And thank you to Derek and Mike for a really excellent report and really a timely report. And Derek can explain why he did it at this moment, but I felt like it is a report for this moment because we as a global community are really reflecting on what will the international system look like? What will the relations be? What will be the power dynamic? And what will be the defining agenda going forward. The organization I work for is, yes, a very action-oriented organization, and we really try to both be a source of measurement and informing people by doing annual reports, but also doing a lot of advocacy and then working with people on the ground. And our reports have shown 18 years of democratic decline around the world. And many of us in the community and really across the world are asking ourselves, what will define this next period? Which countries will be leading? Which non-state actors, both malign and positive, will be leading in this era? And I think this report pushes into a lot of the really hard questions that truthfully many communities don't really want to wrestle with. So I'll just elevate a few things that jumped out to me and then highlight a few that I think are important for the listeners to take away. This question in the report captures this very well. The desire for democracy around the world is not going away. We have had 18 years of democratic decline, but that is because autocratic countries have taken their game up a notch, because I think they also recognize the threat that democracy poses to regimes that want to hold on to power forever. And when you have both this surge in autocratic efforts married with the reality that this year half of the world's population went to the ballot box, it does tell me that democracy still is the norm that people are hanging on to, and people are going to the streets pushing back on some very fierce autocrats because it is worth risking their lives for. So the desire for democracy still remains very, very strong, but we have to wrestle with many of these questions, which the report articulates so well. This question about the pendulum swing is really, it's not a question, the statement of the fact that we have seen democracy as the thing and then not the thing over and over. And it really has been a reaction to the Second World War, to the First and Second World War, to Vietnam, to Iraq. And we have then said, no, it's all out. It's all in, it's the defining thing, it doesn't exist at all. And that has not helped the credibility of countries that are working to advance democracy around the world. It hasn't helped many of our organizations that, like ours, that are in this space that have been doing this for 80 plus years. But it hasn't helped people also understand what is the relationship between democracy, security, economic development on all of these issues. But that is where this report is really important to show that this is not a zero-sum game, and it is to our peril that we try to separate things which really are intrinsically not separable. Every foreign policy is based on values. It will be, inevitably. The question is what values, and to what extent do those values underpin other parts of your foreign policy? And what we know is that democratic values, governments that work transparently, governments that are accountable to their people, governments that adapt as the needs of their people and the needs of the world evolve, and governments that are able to adhere to rule of law. Those are more stable governments. They are more secure governments. They are more economically prosperous governments. And so this whole idea that these things have been an either or has been a false dichotomy that I'm really thankful this report is pushing into. And so it is that democracy is not, as Derek just said, it's not just this nice, soft, squishy thing which you can get to when you've done all the other things. It really is, it is both the right idea, but the good idea, because it does underpin our security and our economic development. I'd love to just pull out a few things which I thought were really important and I think are worthy of further unpacking. This point, and Derek made it so well, about the narrative, is one which I think we really have to, as a foreign policy community, wrestle with, because I do think we are losing the narrative somewhat. All of the great research, including what the Nobel Prize winners have been researching for years about the importance of institutions, much of that is not shaping the views. There's a very, very aggressive anti-democratic, anti-freedom agenda that has a very sophisticated narrative game. And we, in not just in the democracy and freedom community, but really across the board, our defense community, our economic and business communities, need to think about how are we talking about these issues and making the case. I do think the report also brings in a lot of other actors other than those of us who work for Freedom House, NDI, IRI, and those that are in this democracy space. It is the job and it is the partnership to be had with the security community, with the business community, and others. And I think that's what sits before us as to how we have allies in all of those places. How do we really rev those up to really build those relationships even stronger? And then the last point I would make is just this question about leadership. The world is going through lots of leadership transitions. We're having one in the United States, France, Germany, Canada, the UK. You talked about South Korea earlier today, and that's in addition to the undemocratic, the nations with undemocratic leadership, Syria, and many other governments that are going through transitions. We have a question of who is going to step in this moment and lead and really show that democracy is the foundation on which we can build a more stable and secure global community and a more prosperous community.
Thank you for those excellent points about U.S. leadership. I know that is the framing with which so many of our illustrious members of Congress are always concerned about U.S. foreign policy is how are we leading, with what values, with what policies? And I also really appreciate your points about the need to, the desire and demand for democracy around the world. And we've certainly seen that in many of the movements that are pushing back against anti-democracy and that are leading the way and, like you said, risking their lives to be able to promote this. And many of us have probably seen that with our own eyes. I know I witnessed that in Egypt when I saw protesters just being beaten in my early 20s. And that's something that shaped my understanding of the kind of fragile state of democracy and the way it can be, attempted to be brutally taken out, and yet how the spirit remains within those people that continue to get on the street and demand it, or to do it underground when they need to. So I'm extremely glad that Dan Twining has been able to join us. Thank you so much. Dan, we've been having a conversation talking about Derek's and Mike Green's new report on democracy and grand strategy in American foreign policy. And Nicole has given some initial thoughts after Derek shared a little bit of some of the findings from that report. I also mentioned how your institutions are so action oriented, and I've seen this firsthand in your programs and the promotion that you do. So I would love to turn over to you to hear a little bit about your thoughts on this notion we've been talking about the fact that in a presidential transition where U.S. foreign policy may have some shifts, it may have some shifts in the way it views multilateralism, internationalism, and of course, in the notion of the U.S. role in the world and whether and how the U.S. supports democracy in other countries. So the report argues that this shouldn't be a pendulum shift. This is an area of foreign policy that is strategic and that has elements that really should remain across administration. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on your message on, the role and consistency, if you agree with that sentiment.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm really delighted to be here with you. I so appreciate CSIS's leadership on this topic. It's great to be back with Derek Mitchell, my old wingman, as well as in absentia, our friend Mike Green. Mike and I wrote a foreign affairs article, kind of an early version of this argument. This one is better, more developed, more fulsome on this very topic. I really like the report. I appreciate, Michelle, going straight to your point, the exquisitely kind of bipartisan / nonpartisan nature of it and the core strategic argument behind it. Which I don't even want to, I'm actually going to quote Derek because I know we heard from him, but this is in the conclusion. Most people read the executive summary, but some of the best material here is at the end. If a strategist were told that a single factor would advance global peace, development, health, and security outcomes while making one the natural ally of billions of people worldwide, one would think that issue would be considered a strategic priority. Right? That's our support as Americans for democracy and human freedom in the world. A smartly implemented democracy agenda would play to one of the most valuable strategic assets in the U.S. arsenal, the power to inspire and attract billions of people worldwide who seek the same rights and dignity as embodied in the American ideal. This is really powerful stuff. I think from from where I sit, I mean, I agree with obviously everything my friend Nicole said. Um, but I mean, if I can just use the R in my middle name, as president of the International Republican Institute, we actually hosted the largest national security event at the Republican Convention in Milwaukee over the summer in August. And we did this, we're a nonpartisan organization. We do this with private money. There's no actual partisan agenda behind this. NDI does the same thing at the Democratic Party convention every 4 years. And the goal is basically to try to mainstream some of these ideas in a very different audience, probably to the one who attends CSIS conferences. And also to try to reinforce the instincts of the new incoming team. We didn't know it was going to be the incoming team at the time because we hadn't yet had an election around some of these fundamental principles. Mike Waltz actually opened our event, who's the incoming national security advisor. And Mike co-authored the national security piece of the Republican platform. And that platform actually highlights support for American values around the world. Now, I think we would all call them universal values. We know they're universal values, but this is a domestic political document. It highlights really kind of sticking it to dictators, right? It actually connects the fact that America's great power adversaries in the world are authoritarians. And it really talks about restoring American leadership. Now, that's easy to say, hard to do. We can talk about the verb around American leadership, but I was very pleased that there was this emphasis on kind of American values and the ideals of freedom, supporting individual freedom, that there was this emphasis on standing up to dictators and dictatorship who threaten Americans' national security. And also there was this kind of imperative that the US has to lead on these issues. One of my board members, Senator Marco Rubio, if confirmed, will be the next Secretary of State. We know how passionate he is about these issues. I think for this new team, I mean, to get directly at this transition issue, for this new team, there is a particular interest in Latin America. I mean, I think we all understand that democracy in Latin America has not gone in the right way in many countries, not just for the last 4 years, but frankly, over the past decade or so. We also are acutely aware of the foreign malign interference in our own neighborhood by China, Russia, Iran, and really the very negative role that Cuba plays in countries like Venezuela in enforcing dictatorship and tyranny and reinforcing it. So there's a particular interest in Latin America. I think there's a particular interest in this nexus of Chinese malign influence that comes through these forms of political coercion, economic coercion, corruption, elite co-optation, United Front operations. All of these are things, as Derek has said, that actually we can get at by promoting accountability, transparency, free elections, parliamentary oversight, independent media. I see this as a real opportunity. I mean, I don't want to go on too long, Michelle, but I'll just close with the fact that I think they are also laser focused on this changing Middle East. And frankly, the pressure that the dictatorship in Iran is under, having lost the leadership of its terrorist allies in Hezbollah and Hamas, having witnessed the fall of the House of Assad after 50 years. We know, including from IRI polling, how unhappy Iranians are, a supermajority of Iranians with their own regime, with their own system, with their limited rights and freedoms. So there's a real opportunity without wars and bombs and guns and fighting, I think, for the new administration to go back to this policy that they began of maximum pressure on Iran. The Iranian system is much more vulnerable to possible, I hope, peaceful change that mellows the threat Iran poses to its neighbors and the free world.
Thank you. Excellent points. I really appreciate it. I think, one thing that you brought up that's been a theme of this discussion and also is highlighted in the report is sort of this idea of the idea that this is not something, democracy is not something around the world that the US is promoting alone. This is something that galvanizes our allies. It's something that, as you mentioned, the autocrats in the world, they're often working together to share tips on how to crack down on civil society, how to use particular internet laws to arrest bloggers that are exercising any modicum of criticism of their government. So they're sharing those tips with each other, and it's the countries that are supporting democracy that can also band together to strategically approach this in a way that I think both last two national security strategies demonstrated can't be done alone. So I'm curious to hear what your sense is of who needs to be part of this consensus. I'll actually open this to any of you three. The consensus around democracy, this is something that I know it's been pointed out that a lot of people, a particular generation of people, got their start working on democracy and human rights in the context of the Cold War, in which it was an era where there was just much greater consensus around the role that democracy and human rights promotion should be playing in US foreign policy. But given the fact that this consensus has eroded, as Derek pointed out, and that there are more objections to this being at the forefront of U.S. foreign policy, who needs to be part of this discussion, and who should be part of building this consensus that is currently not?
I'm happy to jump in on a couple of pieces, but let me also mention one piece. You were talking about the collaboration that needs to exist among democratic actors, but I think we also have to say the organizations that all of us have worked for have also had a commitment to working with the people in the country, which is radically different, I think, than how autocratic leaders are engaging any of the countries in which they are exerting their influence, right? All of our organizations, as well as the United States government, has gone into countries really to listen to what the interests of the people are and really to be able to represent those or to respond to those in supporting that. So I think that is just something we need to weave into it. I think we're at a critical place right now to see which democratic governments are going to be willing to step up and make this a key part of their foreign policy, not as a banner or a bumper sticker, but really to integrate it into how that they run their security policy, how they run their economic policy. And there's a lot of different ways that that can look, right? It doesn't have to look like one particular administration that we've had in the United States, but it does have to say that how we actually build relations with other countries has to be anchored in these values. I think we're seeing a lot of transition, particularly in Europe right now and in other regions, that it's unclear which of those governments or what those governments are going to look like within the next 3 to 6 months. And it's unclear as to which ones are going to emerge. But I think we also do need to think well outside of the box, that this is not going to be something that can be run by international organizations or democratic governments alone. It really does have to look at who are the actors that are major stakeholders right now. And that does include corporations. It does include security, the security parts of governments around the world, and to say that this is not a battle that can be waged singularly with a handful of non-governmental organizations and a few democracies. And so I think right now we're at this point of sort of reconceptualizing some of those coalitions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that stovepiping of this issue that I mentioned earlier, that this has been a traditional sort of NGO, DRL, stovepipe. It's and it doesn't feed into the hard thinkers, So I think getting, some folks in uniform, the security thinkers, and there are folks in the Pentagon, I've met several who recognize, I was at a dinner once, and the question was asked of each of us, what's the single factor that you think is most important for global security? And I thought I was going to be the edgy one and say, democracy and governance. And there's a lieutenant general of the Army who stood up, first one, and said, I led the counterterrorism center, and the issue is governance. It's governance. It's how, that's the foundation for international. Then I asked him afterwards, how many people think like you in the building? And he said, not many. There was some general sense of that, around the Afghanistan time, and, but it is not deeply embedded in that strategic security community. And, I think think tanks have to start with this. It has to, Dan and Nicole and I were part of an initiative when I was at NDI to try to start this in concentric circles. We start with people that kind of get it at the center and bring folks along who are in the think tank community, and then move to another sector who had not quite bought into it, and see if we can build out a constituency of people that get this idea. But it's not going to happen overnight. You really do have to get to communities that are not typical. So that's military, that is businesses, to explain why, kleptocratic world where rule of law does not rule is not good for business. And that elite capture, when we have Foreign Corrupt Practices Act restrictions, is not good for you. A globe that is shaped more in liberal ways is going to work for the adversary rather than U.S., and get them to see it as not, again, something that is intrusive, but that is supportive. Again, I think the mental baggage that's there within our allies, within Japan and others, we just have to chip away at that. And it's going to take some leadership within the U.S. government. I don't know how else it happens, but there is no alternative to U.S. leadership in this regard.
Michelle, could I just mention a constituency that hasn't just in this immediate conversation, which is the U.S. Congress? I mean, there are a lot of new members. There are a lot of staff members who obviously don't remember the Cold War and the Twilight Struggle and freedom versus tyranny, the Soviet Empire. There's a real job for all of us to do in helping members of Congress understand the U.S. toolkit of power and influence. Now, all of us in this conversation care about democracy and freedom, I think, for intrinsic reasons. But there also, of course, is a very strong national security compunction, as Derek's excellent report lays out. So we are, as we see in real time, in an environment of cut, right? Rising debt, too much government spending. But the fact is, I mean, for instance, in Syria, just to take a country I'm not at all an expert in, we have a whole civilian toolkit. Many of us, NDIRI, many of us have been working in Syria for many, many years, waiting for the moment when democratic and civic space would emerge, as it is doing right now. And then the question is always, do good people with the right principles get in there and help to build civic and democratic infrastructure? Or is it just the men with guns who create a different form of tyranny over a country? So it's a lot cheaper and more cost-effective and more advantageous for U.S. interests to deploy the civilian toolkit that we have to support a transition in Syria. And I'm very open to the argument that this is a hard case and don't lead with this, right? I'm just mentioning it because it's in the news. But the fact is that it's much more cost-effective to help transitional societies succeed in governing themselves decently and justly. Those kind of countries, as they develop into open societies with credible institutions and popular participation, those countries don't invade and try to swallow their neighbors like Russia's doing in Ukraine. They don't export global mass migration, uncontrolled mass migration of the kind we've seen out of Venezuela under Maduro's kleptocracy. They do not germinate the violent extremism that came right home to us in Washington on 9/11, right? These are countries that ultimately become hopefully friends and allies and partners of the United States and advance kind of a public good of security in their regions rather than basket cases, failed states, or new conflicts and wars. So these civilian instruments that are so underfunded already that congressmen, I understand, and women without a whole lot of background sometimes want to take the knife to, this is part of this kind of arsenal, frankly, that preserves our defense budget and protects our armed forces from, frankly, having to fight, and from the U.S. from having to spend billions of dollars to try to rescue a failed state or run a giant evacuation or otherwise protect our interests in periods of extremis.
Yeah. I just add one more thing. Please go ahead, Nicole.
I was just going to jump in on another institution or sets of institutions, which we also haven't talked about, and Dan and Derek will not be surprised. I think that our university system has to really, really be looked at. If we do have generals or, colonels and others down the line that don't understand these things, and we have people who are going to the Hill to be staffers and legislative assistants that don't understand these issues, and we need to start at a level of how are we educating the next generation to be democratic citizens of our own country, but certainly globally minded. And I think what we also have to do is challenge our system to double click a little bit deeper to answer some of the questions that Dan was just putting forward. If you then say, what does the international community need to do in Syria right now? Once you start to double click, you realize that your choice very quickly goes, well, we can send a bunch of troops and we can send a ton of money, or we can start to build a sustainable long-term democratic society. That takes people to click a little bit further down the line and to really unpack and wrestle with hard issues. And that is, many of our universities are doing it, but now is the time where we really have to capture this moment to say we have to produce people who are prepared to answer very hard questions, to ask the questions of what are the values that are going to be underpinning the international system. If we're reopening the whole system or asking a lot of hard questions, we can either leave it to momentum, or we can really have a generation that's going to own this next era based on the values that are going to be most sustainable and secure.
And I think we're in an age where there's a lot of cynicism about this, right? I mean, among young people, we used to hear about, there's a decline in support for democracy. And I never believed it, and it's not true. You talk to them and go, it's because I think there are some myths and misunderstanding about democracy. They just see, well, look at America and we're in trouble. We have the problems of our own democracy, or countries have had elections and they haven't succeeded, and the problem is democracy. And I've always said in my past that the problem is not democracy, it's weak democracy. And the answer to it is actually better democracy. And the way you do that, you have to educate or explain to people what we're talking about, define the terms. You don't like democracy, really, young person. You don't want to hold your government accountable. You don't want inclusive, you don't want a voice in how you're governed. You don't want to know what they're doing. You don't want transparent. You don't want everybody involved equally. You don't want representation under law. Really, but again, they have an idea that democracy is simply the way it's working now. And America's faulty, the problems we have in our own democracy is somehow representational or representative of democracy writ large. And I think we need to be getting back to definitional issues of explaining what we mean in those unpacking ways. I think the term democracy itself has so much baggage these days that sometimes you have to talk about it in more practical terms: transparent, accountable, inclusive, representative governance under law, and take it away from when China might redefine it, and take it away from the cynics. You also get, if you have questions from the audience here, I'm sure the first question Dan and I would get, or Nicole, Dan and I would get if we were on a panel from American audience, is how can you promote this abroad when we're so sick here at home? And how can you lecture people abroad when American democracy is so fraught? And what we're making the case is not that, America has to be the model, or that, we represent democracy's well-being or not. People around the world, as we said, are struggling for their rights, and they're looking for help. And the demand for democracy is as strong as ever. And empirically and objectively, a more democratic world is better for us. So even as we struggle ourselves with this, and we have to get our own house in order, it is not the time to simply, withdraw. And I think there have been many people in the elite communities and the strategic communities and the policy communities that have succumbed to that myth that we can't do this abroad because we are not somehow perfect, which we've never been at home. And I think that's a false dichotomy. And we have to overcome that cynicism and that self-restraint that I think is quite pernicious to shape a world that, as Nicole says, is up for grabs right now.
These are really important points, and I think the gets back to the conversation on the kind of the backlash and how it can be overcome. Your report has made a lot of kind of specific recommendations for ways that this can be addressed, and I think you're getting at certainly, I think, one important point of many, but one important point about the fact that democracy is by its nature local, and that the U.S., even the way that the best practices and funding landscapes have evolved. They've evolved, at least in more what I think a lot of civil society organizations considered to be more progressive means, not progressive in terms of left, but progressive in terms of this is moving forward their agendas better, is by giving them programmatic support instead of ring-fenced funding for particular projects, basically allowing local communities and partners to be able to define what they think is the right way forward. And that's, to me, an analogy for what kind of progress you're calling for when you're saying that the democracy support has to be tailored and localized and is not based on a cookie cutter export of a U.S. particular model or even a moment in history that captures a particular kind of U.S. governance. So I think these are really important. I would love to hear what the practical things are that others see as ways forward for how to make this real, to how to make democracy promotion, to take it away from the term and to make it real for people. I know that USAID's approach over the past couple of years has been around this idea of democracy delivers, that they're thinking about what are the services that people get, because that's maybe if they don't say they're thinking about, an abstract concept of democracy, but they're thinking about the fact that things in their life are working and they're consistent. The terms you mentioned, Eric, about it being inclusive or representative. So What are some of the ways to make this real for people? Nicole or Dan, love to hear your thoughts.
The report touches on this. We have to help democracies protect themselves. I mean, there's this excellent line, democracy is said to be in decline in the world, but it's better understood to be under attack. Foreign authoritarians are assaulting democratic systems. You just saw this in Romania, where they literally had to cancel. Romania is an EU democracy. They had to cancel their presidential election because Russian interference was so over the top. Moldova, the people of Moldova, every public opinion, including IRI's polling, showed Maya Sandu and her party winning decisively. It was such a close-run thing, they had to go to a second round. And it's been chronicled, the degree of Russian malfeasance and very active interference in vote buying. So, I mean, I think this resonates with Americans as much as anyone else. Who do you want electing your government, right? Nicole and Dan and Derek and Michelle and everybody in this group watching, or Vladimir Putin and some guys in the Kremlin, right? Like who gave them a vote? They don't get a vote. And funnily enough, people in every country feel just as strongly about this as we do, that they want to make their choice. We've seen this all over the world, literally in every region. Now, there's a whole separate panel to be had about how do you protect democracy. But that gets into the information space. It gets into some of these very malign forms of information manipulation. It gets into how do you actually protect electoral integrity in kind of a high-tech 21st century way, not just, having NDI and IR observers watching paper ballot counting, but what kind of pre-election media environment are you sustaining? Foreign financing of political parties. I mean, Mike in absentia would raise this. I'm raising it for him, that the Chinese Communist Party had penetrated Australia's political system when it was financing Australian politicians who were sitting members of parliament. Australia discovered this. Its intelligence service raised the alarm, and their allies and the politicians cleaned up their system. But this is not something only for kind of poor countries in the global south. These issues affect us very, very directly in the rich and prosperous global West. I have a lot more to say on this, but I do think part of what we need to do, helping democracy deliver, protecting democracy to ensure actual democratic outcomes, that these are fundamental.
I agree with everything that Dan said, and I would really double tap on the importance also of internet security and just cybersecurity generally, because I think that many of these countries are sustaining absolutely unrelenting, and I would say that Derek is sitting in one, but unrelenting attacks from authoritarians, not in a kinetic way, but in a cyber very sophisticated way. And we have to recognize that these are attacks on sovereign nations. And it's important that we join forces together to help our allies and help countries that are democratic and are struggling and are working really, really hard to hold on to their democracy, help them protect themselves against that type of consistent cyber attack. I think we have to look very closely at this issue of corruption and kleptocracy. The fact that there are autocrats that are using legitimate systems to use loopholes to get around different rules and regulations in order to enrich themselves. They don't have to rely on a tax base of people that they govern and that they get taxes from in a very systematic way. They rely on a kleptocratic system, which relies on cronies that are that benefit from illegal dealings. And I think that we cannot allow, our banking system cannot allow structures which have been set up for normal transactions to be used by any of these autocratic regimes as well. I do think this issue of the narrative and the integration into our security, into our economic conversations is going to be important. And part of it, I love the idea of democracy delivering, and I'm not speaking against that in any way. It's absolutely extraordinary, important that democracies deliver to their citizens. That's what a democracy is about. But I also want to guard against democracy being seen as the vending machine, that if it gives me the thing that I want, then we're good. Because the reality is democracies struggle and democracies don't always deliver immediately. So yes, I want them to deliver fully. And when they don't, is the time that you need more democracy. You need more citizen engagement. You need better legislators, better leaders, better feedback loop. And so that narrative and explaining to people that democracy isn't going to be something that just gives you what you want, because China is doing a great job of saying, we're just going to give you what you want. And so if they think democracy delivering, it's not doing my thing, I'm going to go to China, we are feeding into something which is dangerous. And so what we need to really capture that narrative to say, democracies deliver best when they do the things that democracies need to do best, which is have citizens engaged, would have leaders accountable to their citizens, have leaders be accountable for non-corrupt practices underpinned by the rule of law. That's when we have people see that all of those great adjectives that Derek said, transparency and accountability, that is what democracy is, and that then results in the delivery.
I think that is such an important point. It definitely gets back to something Derek was saying earlier too, that I feel like the message I'm hearing that I hope our audience takes away is the answer to less democracy or weak democracy is more democracy. And in that, what I'm hearing from you all is that there's an active element. It's not a passive system in which people can sit back and everything's taken care of for them. The long-term benefits of democracy come from engaging, is what I'm hearing from you. It's from someone raising their hand and saying, we're struggling, I will do this. I will organize. I will bring citizens together. I will create a new institution. I will do what needs to be done to protect the fragility of democracy that can be threatened by being, sort of laissez-faire, sitting back and watching people be enriched in the ways you're describing with kleptocracy. One, I think, element that came out in the report too was we've mentioned the security community, we've alluded a little bit to the economic, but the role of the business community. I would love to hear, as we go into this new administration, what are some ways that, as the business community gets a spotlight, in some ways are going to be joining the new government in the United States. Certainly the report makes the argument that they should be harnessed and that it's in their interest to do this, but would love to hear your thoughts on their role.
Happy to jump into some of these. I think we already have many allies in the business community, but we need to expand who they are and the role that they play. I think there's been a lot of pressure on the business community recently to take positions on policy issues and to make that the measurement of their engagement in democracy. And I think we have to come back to sort of a fundamental place of the scaffolding and the values of democracy, right? The scaffolding meaning rule of law, support for democratic institutions, a support for how democracy functions as the first and foremost front line of what businesses should be supporting. And I do think we should be encouraging and equipping or informing our colleagues in the business community of what does that look like when you're in another country. You have a tremendous amount of influence when you're an American business or a business from any country going into another country. How do you wield that influence in a way which reinforces the values, the democratic processes that will then create an open environment for better business practices? And I think that's where if I were running a business, that wouldn't be the first thing that I'm thinking about, because I'm thinking about how to run my business. We have to, and those of us in this space have to be part of that conversation and part of equipping our colleagues to be able to navigate some of those challenging issues.
Michelle, I'm so glad you asked this question. I want to connect it to something Nicole said previously. We all talk about democracy and we immediately focus on government and the role of government and US national security policy and kind of what the bureaucracies need to do, what the policy setting should be. In fact, democracy is not about the government. The role of the government is to secure individual liberty so that all of us can flourish in freedom and security. That is actually the function of government. When government controls the commanding heights of the economy, to get to the business question, the business community, people cannot be free. If there is not economic freedom, there will not be political freedom, right? The only rich countries in the world where there are not strong and credible institutions and a level playing field under rule of law are essentially oil-rich monarchies in the Gulf. In every other country, including in Japan and Korea, including in societies like Taiwan, including certainly in Europe and the United States, North America, the proposition over many centuries was, yes, the business community will support you, Mr. King or Madam Monarch, if you give us the space and freedom to flourish as business enterprises. And the civic proposition was the same. This goes back to Tocqueville in the United States, that fundamentally what makes American democracy strong and healthy, I'm optimistic about American democracy. It's not the government, it's the civic sector. It's what you said, Michelle, about, hey, we're all going to get out and organize, not just to vote, but to clean up our communities or undertake this or that civic initiative. That really, in a democracy, agency lies with citizens, not the government. And I think, including in our community and in conversations like this, we've grown a bit, we've come off this philosophical approach over the years, and everything becomes about the government, and everything becomes about, I don't know, President Biden hosting a summit for democracy, or getting that democracy line into the joint statement with country X when the president meets with their president. And we've got to go back to a more kind of a bottom-up organic understanding. I mean, this is the kind of work that I know IRI, Freedom House do in the world. We're doing bottom-up work that fundamentally a strong civic foundation is as fundamental to democracy as those government institutions. So there's a bottom-up piece here that goes with the top-down piece. That's where you create balance, and it's that balance between society and the state that creates the kind of free society that we all want to live in.
Just a couple points on this, on the business one, because there are two different points. There's a business and then there's a civic, and I think they're both very important, good points. And I completely agree with what Dan said and Nicole. On the business side, I mean, they're about bottom line, right? They're about profits and how do they make profits, and you know, but they're starting to talk about the need for real stability. It's not false stability, the artificial stability of the past that's provided by some monarch or some dictator, because they realize that's a very thin reed to put your investments in. So they talk about resilience. They talk about societal resilience more and more. They talk more about they always talk about predictability. And so you have to make the case to them that democracy support is not against the grain in a society. It's consistent with where citizens want to go. It's a good way to brand yourselves. It's supportive of certain norms one hopes in countries that they are struggling with, whether it's gender equality or a civic empowerment or such. It's hard. You get a business to take a chance to underwrite this stuff when they're looking simply at their bottom lines. It's difficult, but I think more and more they are thinking about what makes for a strong society and explain to them and showing them empirically your investments are going to be safer with certain things, and your brand will be stronger with you underwriting certain things. On the civic side, I mean, it gets to the narrative and this issue of democracy delivering. It's making sure we manage expectations. I think there was this view in the 90s that you become democratic or you want to be like America, and tomorrow you could be rich and powerful, and they're just being held back. And then they find out they had a few elections, the same old guys with the same old mindsets, just with different processes get in, and they get the same results, and they're frustrated by it. And they don't realize this stuff takes time, that it's not going, and that, it's not going to deliver immediately, but it does need to deliver something, because human nature is basically, if your basic needs are not being met, then you're going to succumb to the demagogue or someone who says, I alone can fix this. Give me all the power. I'll do it for you. This is not working. There's too much gridlock. And then they'll blame democracy for the problem. And so we have to be able to define our terms and explain this is hard. This is not easy. This is not going to lead to immediate results, but we do have to somehow show a connection between a better life, whether it's more of a voice. It doesn't have to be economic. It can be other things, but a better life and this thing we talk about as democracy. It has to be explicitly connected somehow by us. Otherwise, they won't necessarily make the connection.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think your comments were causing me to reflect too on the fact that I think underlying some of what we've talked about today is the fact that it's more than institutions. It's more than elections. It's more than a checkbox it's also cultural change. And I
Yeah.
think the idea of your report demonstrating that having the longevity, the strategic foresight to be able to stick with this and understand that, I think managing expectations is a really important phrase, because it's not a magic thing that can happen overnight. Even as we see dramatic upheavals in countries' governance, can certainly bring changes and can bring new dawns. We talked about Syria a little bit, that Dan brought up. After this long struggle that started with specifically a movement of democracy, to now get to a place where they have to rebuild institutions, they have to rebuild trust, and that trust is going to be part of hopefully a culture of change that will allow them to have a voice and to create governance they want. But I wanted to say that the this notion of culture and institutional change too. I've been reflecting over the past few days. I was speaking at the Naval War College and got to speak with someone that's an expert on your old area of focus, Derek, in Myanmar, and the fact that women are on the forefront. 60% of the democratic activists and opposition are women that are leading the groupings, the resistance, the democratic channels. And there's a lot of evidence, just like there is on democracy, there's a lot of evidence that the status of women in society is linked to better outcomes for those societies in terms of what their governance and their long-term peace looks like. And that the things like violence against women is often a precursor to larger scale violence, and is something that, when it's invisible, when those effects are invisible, can really affect societies. So I bring this up because I meant your comment that this is hard, this is long, this is strategic. A lot of the changes may be cultural, they may take time, and they may involve, and I don't say cultural like culture as somewhere else and we have no culture. I say culture as in the culture of institutions, the culture that all of us exist in. These are things that may require redesign in some sense, and they require patience. So I'd love to hear any of your thoughts on definitely how the US can be in it for the long term, support movements of women that are on the front lines or other activists, especially, and how they can support these moments where countries are, struggling to redesign how they approach their culture or institutions. It's a big question. So whoever wants to go first.
I'll point to, I'm not sure I'm going to have an answer to the entire question, but I think we have a significant gap in the international system. And Mike and Derek's paper talked about just the need for international institutions. We have a situation in Syria as just the most current example, and all of us know it's really important that Syria becomes a stable, viable state that has democratic governance, because if not, in the very center, in the heart of the Middle East and very close to Europe, you will have a nation that is a failed state, or a state that has illiberal governance, or a protracted conflict among non-state actors. We know those are the paths, but we don't really have a concerted effort that can say these are nations or institutions or corporations or non-state actors or whomever that come together systematically to help a nation that's been under 50 years of autocratic brutality get on and do the thing which has taken our nation a really long time to do in relative peace. There's not an immediate action. And I think we have to grapple in the international system with the fact that we know how hard what is ahead of the Syrian people is. We know that the paths look really bad if it doesn't go well. And yet, to some extent, we now have this openness, and we're just going to think about which of the external actors are going to exert the most amount of influence. I think we have to either plus up the democracy community to be those frontline supporters. We need to have ad hoc coalitions of nations that are willing to do it, neighbors and others that are willing to support in benign, supportive ways, or we need to have some institution that's made capable of doing that. But right now, I don't think we have that answer in the international system.
No, could I just mention two specific cases building on Nicole? Maria Corina Machado in Venezuela was banned from running, but her team won that election. Edmundo Gonzalez was her stand-in. She is in that country right now fighting They won 67-30 against Maduro on a totally rigged, unlevel playing field. The score would have been higher. The gap would have been even wider if it had been even a more credible election. She is one example of an amazing, brave, courageous woman who wants to lead her country in a completely different direction. So part of, Michelle, you asked a really big question that's sort of hard to answer, but I think part of what we need to do is stand with great women who want to lead their countries into a democratic future. Another I would mention is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who won Belarus's election in 2020. Another rigged, unlevel playing field where the state media was all in favor of the incumbent, who is a Soviet-era dictator. Democratic forces organized. We did a poll, an IRI poll in Belarus just before the election, showing she would win. She was standing in for her husband, who was the original candidate, who was put in a political prison and remains there now nearly 5 years later for daring to run against the dictator, the tyrant Lukashenko. So, but as Nicole says, the Belarusian dictator stole this election and the world didn't do much. Maduro right now is trying to steal this Venezuelan election. His fake inauguration is going to be January 10. So the window is open. It is documented that he lost. What are we doing as a country? What is the world doing? We need to support these incredible women who are risking everything for the very values that we're sitting here talking about. And as Nicole said, there should be no authoritarian impunity. It's harder in a case like Burma. There is no one national leader. Derek can speak to that, having worked closely with Aung San Suu Kyi in a different period. But where we have a democratic institution in the form of an amazing woman with a democratic mandate, we should be all in supporting that kind of transition.
Yeah.
This issue of recognition is an absolutely stunningly easy and important one. And it has to be one that the international community does quickly after an election. Because if we don't, and if we get to January 10th in Venezuela and the world watches and Maduro is inaugurated, what we are saying is, great, I know you all went to the street. I know you worked really hard. We saw you won freely and fairly, and you won with overwhelming majority, and probably it should have been more had there not been such corruption. But you know what? We're not going to stand with you. And when we've watched the Venezuelan people come to the streets, many of them, which many of our organizations work with, are in jail. And the treatment is unspeakable. And what we're saying when we say there was a democratic process and people worked really hard to get there and they worked really hard to show up, and then we don't honor it. And then not only do we not honor it, but then we're going to invite these people, or we're going to sit at the UN, or we're going to sit elsewhere and say, the person who gets to sit behind the nameplate that the American president or the American Secretary of State gets to do because they earned it, because they earned the votes, we're just going to say, great, you just held out longer. That's not a sustainable international system. It's not sustainable for security, for economic viability, and it's not sustainable just for human dignity to flourish. And so we really have to wrestle with how do we get coalitions of nations to come immediately after election, immediately after some interruption of power, to be able to stand with the person or the people that the people of the nation themselves have chosen.
And that's the key, the issue of coalitions. I mean, America leads, but we can't do it alone. If we're standing alone on this stuff, it can't hold. And finding ways, again, to convince our allies and partners, and some of them may get it, Canada may get it, or individual might get it, but to explain to Japan or some key European allies why this really is strategic. It really does matter for all of our collective interests. And we have to, we're facing an alternative autocratic axis that is supporting the other side to our detriment. It has to start with us. We have to understand why this stuff is strategic overall. And then we've got to bring it to our allies and make that case. So there's a number of different stages here to get this right. The other thing I'd say is this issue of culture, which is really important. It gets back to your question, the broader question about women, and I mean, you can make that case about women's leadership. It's certainly true in Myanmar, but in Sudan, in Belarus, in Thailand. I mean, you can go down the list in Hong Kong. There are many women that were leaders in all of this, and it's critical. But this issue of creating a new culture, I think, has to be sustained by the U.S. So when USAID, and I think they've picked up on this, is a point I used to make when I was back at NDI to Samantha Power, which is it shouldn't be that democracy is a stovepipe. You know, when I was asked as ambassador in Myanmar, I was asked once, tell me your democracy program. And I said, I looked to the side, I said, well, everything we're doing is a democracy program. We're doing a health program, and embedded in it is inclusivity and community building and choice and transparency and accountability and linking up, decisions between local administrators and local farmers and in agriculture. So embedding that culture in everything we do. And again, partnering with other aid agencies with the same mindset that what we're doing is a long-term cultural shift. It's a mindset, it's a way people think and how they interact and how citizens think about government. That's what needs to happen. It's not simply holding an election or even building an institution. It's much more complicated than that. I think we have to think about it in those terms. It's not that hard to do necessarily. It just needs to be thought of in that broader strategic frame.
Well, as we are wrapping up, I would like to turn to each of you to give some closing thoughts. We've, I think, moved into an important part of the conversation on action, and I'd like to bring it back to, our audience, of course, is concerned with what the U.S. government, the choices that they will be able to make, not just over the next 4 years, but, moving forward about this important topic that has been, I think everyone on the panel agrees, neglected in a way that is to all of our detriment. And so I would like to ask if you sort of could tell our audience, what are you looking for? What are you looking for in the new administration? What are some things that if they did, it would move U.S. foreign policy more toward a longer term strategic approach to democracy, and would potentially send a message that the security or economic or geopolitical or other concerns are not an automatic superseding of concerns of democracy and human rights. And in the pattern of asking hard questions, I know I've asked a hard question. So to sum it up, it's really, what are you looking for? What change are you looking for as we go into a new era of a new administration?
I think it's the integrated approach that Derek and Mike's report calls for. Let's get away from these wild swings from idealism to realism. By the way, Woodrow Wilson was not an idealist, right? He made all sorts of terrible concessions to nationalists and imperialists in the wake of World War I. Was Jimmy Carter a realist or an idealist, right? Let's get away from these wild swings. Reagan was actually a great idealist, but as the report points out, he negotiated with Gorbachev and the leaders of China and other autocracies very successfully. Let's integrate and mainstream this. Let's understand the connection to our interests. To Derek's point about, the health program in Burma that was inclusive and empowered women, let's understand that we have this civilian toolkit and we produce better outcomes for American interests and American security when we are using this toolkit to invest in successful and inclusive societies with functioning institutions. I'd also say let's put some points on the board, right? It's been an era of authoritarian impunity in many regions of the world in many respects. No, I think that's starting to change. We mentioned Iran being on the back foot, the fall of Assad. If Venezuela should break open in a democratic direction, great. Suddenly you have this big momentum shift. The autocrats are working together more than actually arguably at any point in human history. China and Russia are collaborating more today, right now, than Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany were collaborating on the eve of World War II. This is enabled by technology, right? It's a different world we're living in. But if authoritarians are going to collaborate this actively, why would we resist cooperating as fellow democracies? And by the way, last thought, I also like the report's point that we're not all going to be a bunch of purists here. We're going to work with everyone who wants to be a partner to an agenda that is about sustaining a free and open and prosperous world. So there's plenty of room to work with the Vietnams and Saudi Arabias of the world, for sure. Those relationships at the end of the day are going to depend on, I think, ultimately, the kind of internal reforms in those countries that do bring them into the modern world, that modernize their societies. But we're also going to count on them to be allies to this coalition for freedom in the world, right? Saudi Arabia could be key when it comes to an enduring peace in the Middle East. Vietnam should be an important American ally in sustaining a free and open Indo-Pacific that ultimately protects the democratic aspirations of all people in that wide region. So let's actually not be moralistic and sentimental about this. Let's actually be hard-headed and understand the practical case for this kind of work, integrating it into strategy and policy, and empowering the civilian side of our government and our civic sectors with the tools to go out and advance this agenda.
Unsurprisingly, I agree with Dan on many of those points. But what I would say is the word integrate keeps coming up. We have to integrate democratic values and processes, just as Derek said, into our health programs, into our security training, into our economic development programs. And we have to do it, as the report says, as if it were the thing that will transform the efficacy of these other initiatives, because it is. And so I think it really is that effort to integrate all of those, integrate how we do things with democratic values, and to understand that democracy and democratic systems and democratic institutions are going to be a multiplier effect for all of the other things which different parts of our society think are important. I'm going to be watching the narrative game, and I'm not just watching one administration in one country. I'm really looking at a whole of democratic world effort, right? This is something that democratic governments across the world are going to have to do, that people in civil society, that people in the business community, that in other sectors are going to need to do. We have to aggressively win the narrative battle. And I do think this question about engaging partners that are across the spectrum and bringing them into the conversation is going to be the most important thing, and ensuring that we have a very diverse group of institutions, countries, governments, non-state actors, and others that see this as existential and really the foundation to the success in many, many different sectors. And I think that's how we turn this around.
Mm-hmm. If I can answer just in terms of what I would have expected from the Biden administration. I don't know what my expectations are for the incoming. I'll leave my hopes out there. But even with the Biden administration, I had hoped from the very start they would have had a speech. They would have had maybe a strategy. We call for that in this report, a democracy strategy, and not to integrate it certainly into a national security strategy. But to define, as I mentioned earlier, to define our terms. What are we talking about here? What's at stake? Something that is comprehensive, that is similar, sort of an update. We always go back to the Westminster speech as the founding kind of Bible for this stuff. But we have to update that for the new era. And I really had hoped that the Biden folks would have done a better job, or whatever administration could do a better job of laying it out there. From the White House, and then sending that through, sending the signal throughout the bureaucracy that this is part of the new strategic culture. That, as we put at the end here, and Dan used to talk about, we talked about ourselves, that this is the fourth D. But there's diplomacy, defense, development, and democracy, as Nicole said, is the foundation for the rest. That kind of, whether they do that explicitly or implicitly, in declaratory policy, and then in resources and in intent from the White House, that would tell me that they get it, that they're really serious about it, rather than let's just continue to do what we have been doing, which has been okay, but is not sufficient to the challenge that we face. So I don't know when to expect that, but that would send a very powerful signal to me of seriousness.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for taking the time to be here today with what I can attest to are extremely demanding schedules. And Derek, in fact, joining us now at 1:30 in the morning. So thank you so much for doing that from Taiwan. I want to thank as well the Open Society Foundations for providing funding for us to be able to hold events like these. I want to thank our wonderful streaming and broadcasting team here at CSIS, which includes Danesh, Alexander, Arturo, Shi, Theo, Eric, and Craig, the Human Rights Initiative team, Andrew Friedman and Ann Frederick, and of course, all of you who have tuned in today, who will hopefully engage with this content, be active, share this, read the report, comment on the report, because the foundation of democracy and its promotion is certainly participation. It's what we've talked about. It's active engagement. I know I've gotten a great deal out of this, and I do hope that particularly those watching, if you know skeptics who are falling into some of the tropes and traps that we've talked about today about the term for democracy, that you'll share this with them, and we'll find out more about how this can move forward strategically. So thank you from everyone here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you to our distinguished panelists, and we hope that all of you have a wonderful set of holidays here on December 19th, right at the time when people start leaving. So we really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.